Okay, let's start. We've had some technical issues with the screen, so I don't think we're going to be solving it in time. We're extremely happy to have Mariana Mazzucato, all the way from London, who is coming to join our discussion. And we will be continuing our debate on how to enlarge and fulfill the potential of the new economy, or the knowledge economy, or the new technological revolution, however you want to call it. So we're very, very happy that Mariana could take the time for us. So we'll do the usual thing, just 10 minutes, maybe 12 at the outside for Mariana, and then we'll open it up for discussion.
Okay, so is this a microphone? Yes?
That is working. So let me just let's just turn it on. It's not working.
Oh, so I'll take it off. Oh, it is working. Okay, so I still have to hold it like this. I told Danny, he should have told me, don't wear a dress. And I never wear a dress, so it would not have been a big deal, because I don't know where to put this now. Right, so I have these beautiful slides, which you're not going to see because this isn't working. So I've asked them just to email them to you, which will be good. I'm going to set my timer on so I don't speak more than 10 minutes. And so what I wanted to do was to basically involve you in some discussions that we've been having in Europe in terms of this whole issue of what does it mean to confront the kind of reality that economic growth and innovation have not just a rate, but also a direction. And what can we learn from how those directions were set or not set, how it was co-created in periods like the IT revolution, and what might be the lessons for if there is going to be a green revolution or a Green New Deal or new transformation of the economy towards actually achieving the SDGs as opposed to just blabbing about them. What might that mean for how we do our thinking of what policy is for? So in these first beautiful slides, which you don't see, I basically start by not so much making fun of, because otherwise Danny wouldn't like me anymore, but showing the limits of the approach that suggests that we can simply fix market failures or system failures. And the reason I'm going to stand here like mobile is so that this microphone can sit somewhere and I don't have to hold it. And so basically, I start off with saying, or thinking to you, that, first of all, we're living through a really exciting time because this whole issue of directed growth is completely out there. Because after the financial crisis, it was more or less recognized, there was no problem with growth. There was plenty of growth in the 1990s. It was the wrong kind of growth. And there continues to be the wrong kind of growth. So in the UK, we're currently growing through consumption-led growth. That consumption is being fueled by private debt. So the ratio of private debt to disposable income is back at record levels. And guess what? That's what caused the crisis, or at least it was a key cause of the crisis. So we ended up obsessing a lot about public debt, which is or is not a problem. That's not so much the point, but we didn't actually really think through this kind of private debt issue. And so, there's lots of talk about that. How do we definancialize the economy? There's also, of course, this great opportunity since all these countries signed up to the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. That's quite recent in capitalist history, so that's great. How do we think about growth to actually target those? There's also the comeback after years of being a blasphemy of industrial strategy, and I think you've been talking about that probably quite a bit in this course. But all this actually means to redirect the system, right? And so what I've been arguing for some years is that even though the whole kind of fixing of market failures approach is really useful, we should not throw the baby out with the bathwater, it doesn't actually help us necessarily get that kind of transformational growth. Because again, achieving the SDGs requires transformation. It's not just about kind of incrementalizing different little bits of policy here and there. And what I mean also is not just the kind of rigorous framework itself, which has a lot of merit, but a lot of the storytelling around it, at least how it's also understood or misunderstood by policymakers, I think hasn't necessarily equipped them with the right tools. And by that I mean just literally think of the words that we hear, whether it's in white papers or in talks. When you hear ministers around the world talking about things like climate change, you might hear of the need to de-risk the private sector, of enabling, facilitating, fixing different types of market failures, of which, of course, pollution is a massive negative externality, so you'll need things like carbon taxes. Then you have basic research, perhaps, that's needed upstream in the ARPA-E kind of institutions, and that's seen as a public good, a positive externality that requires state investments. And so even though you have that need of public policy entering the system that can also be, if you want, justified through that kind of framework. The problem is that lots of the language itself is very much of sort of a backseat player. And it's not so much about being big or small, it's that the idea of who's kind of driving the growth, the real engine of growth, or if we want to use the word that I kind of put up in my last book on value, the value creators are in business. And at best, what the policymaker can do is fix sort of the problems along the way, for example, the public good problem or the negative externality problem or the asymmetric information problem where you might need SMEs to be financed. And that also, kind of creates a self-fulfilling prophecy that the kind of capabilities we think that bureaucrats need are of a particular type. So the kind of cool courses that you might think of in business school, strategic management, decision sciences, organizational behavior, they're interesting precisely because business is explicitly recognized as creating value. And so you really need to think through those issues of how to think out of the box. There's a famous textbook called Rejuvenating the Mature Corporation, because when corporations get too big, they might get bureaucratic and a bit inertial. When that same thing happens in the public sector, we just kind of use this word bureaucratic. It's too bureaucratic, it's too large, and we start thinking through how to do the riforma della pubblica amministrazione, we call it in Italy, which basically just ends up being, let's cut it, make it more nimble, more flexible. We don't actually think through what are the new capabilities and capacities. Now, I'm being a bit simplistic here. And the kind of point that I tried to make in the entrepreneurial state back in 2013 was that actually, even though there are plenty of market failures, especially not only when we look at innovation, it would have been impossible to understand the advent of some of the biggest general purpose technologies that have affected productivity across the whole economy, have changed production, distribution, and consumption, if we just looked at that policy side through that lens. And so I kind of go through the whole innovation chain in America, looking specifically at the kind of emergence of Silicon Valley, and look at the much broader and deeper involvement of different public organizations across the whole innovation chain. We all know that basic science has been funded by different types of public actors, including the National Science Foundation, which funds plenty of research here at Harvard, but much less about, for example, some of the downstream tools that have been equally ambitious, strategic, and well-funded, including the CIA's public venture capital fund called InQtel, but also the SBIR program, Small Business Innovation Research Program, which has used the power of procurement in the different departments to really allow lots of startups to scale up through public objectives that were required. And if you look at all these different organizations from, again, the DARPA types that were in the Department of Defense, more recently ARPA-E in the Department of Energy, again, the InQtels, as well as the bold and ambitious procurement policies. Don't think good or bad, by the way. Lots of bad stuff happens through these organizations. It's not a normative point, just that transformational point. What's interesting is that what was actually happening within these organizations wasn't necessarily studied, because if we just understand it again as fixing a problem here and there, we think more almost of the quantity or of the policy instrument, but what actually happened within these organizations to even allow them to be as ambitious as really trying to explicitly change the landscape within which you are, as opposed to just fixing an existing problem within an existing landscape. And that kind of story, which I told in IT, where every technology that's in your iPhone that makes your iPhone smart and not stupid, was funded by one of these public agencies, GPS, DARPA, GPS, Internet, touchscreen, Siri, et cetera, we're actually seeing today also in the green economy. So I've done quite a bit of research with my colleague Gregor Semenyak on the emergence of kind of the green tech industry, clean tech, and the green economy, and you basically see the same thing. If you use the Bloomberg New Energy Finance database, you can literally divide it into 4 quadrants. Was that just a quick chat? Okay. I was hoping that at some point you'd see all these wonderful things. So I have this nice graph where I show you all the renewable energy investments. Sorry? Oh, that's fine. Okay. You can look at them. Oh, beautiful. Yeah, just don't look at that now. Look at me. Yeah, that's the problem. I should have said email it later, because now you'll be on the wrong slide. You'll be like, oh, look at that one. Can't remember what I was saying. See, now give me an extra 5 minutes. I got to read. What was I saying? Oh, yeah, got it. Yeah. They say that after you have 3 kids, your brain actually becomes mush. like on some things, and it's been happening. So I have 4 children. After the third, well, actually the third and fourth were together, twins, but my brain's like, what was I saying? So yeah, so that the upper right-hand quadrant, literally think of it as technological risk here and kind of market risk there. Actually, capital intensity on the vertical axis, technological and market risk on the horizontal. That upper right-hand quadrant is basically completely occupied right now by different types of public actors. And what's interesting is, especially if you look at the graph comparing wind and marine, in those areas that are now actually quite established, that's where you get more private sector investments in those areas that still really need to emerge because they are so still uncertain, like marine, you have a greater need for those public investments. Anyway, let me just stop looking at the slides and just say the main thing I wanted to talk about, which was that there's certain lessons about this. This is not about big state good or state versus private sector. What actually got us to the moon and back again in one generation was both public activity and private activity, but it was structured in a particular way. And so I kind of wanted just to finish my last, 3-4 minutes on just really reflecting on this concept of the moonshot, which has been picked up by people like AOC, Alexandria Ocasio, with her Green New Deal agenda, but also, of course, by the private sector. So Google's talking about moonshots and the need for missions. Because a lot of what I've said so far is really that when the public sector has, in the history of technological change been not only active but transformational, it actually had to be organized in a particular way. And it also, and this concept of being mission-oriented, kind of focusing on the big problem, actually got us all this great tech. The tech was a spillover. So the internet solved the problem of getting the satellites to communicate. It wouldn't have happened if they just obsessed about the internet in and of itself. GPS was the solution to a problem of knowing where the ships were in the oceans, right? So how can we use this kind of problem-based thinking to also think of these, coming back to my first point, of how we then really tackle, as opposed to just blab about, the SDGs. Because what the SDGs are challenges, right? They're broad societal challenges. And you don't have to do it through the SDGs, but they're there. We might as well start there. But how do you transform them into these concrete missions, as bold as going to the moon and back again, and then learn the real lessons about that experiment? Because we can't cut and paste the moonshot into every single area, because especially social problems that are much more wicked because of all the political and regulatory issues that they encompass, besides that the moonshot didn't. And I think there's different lessons. One is that lots of different sectors got us there. So bringing industrial strategy outside of that kind of sector-based lens and thinking of it as a problem-based lens, but then really thinking through how do you get lots of different sectors interested in whatever moonshot it is that we're thinking about. Because again, going to the moon, I think, required 13 or 14 different sectors, including nutrition and textiles. And the really interesting thing is all the things that had to be done along the way. There was hundreds of homework problems, projects, of which many failed. But they were fueled. They were trying to, government was using its instruments like procurement, and more recently prize schemes, to really fuel that bottom-up experimentation and exploration. Because innovation does not happen top-down. Danny's written about this a lot. Many of us have written about this a lot. So the Soviet Union was actually spending more than Japan in R&D, didn't achieve innovation-led growth very much because it didn't have those kind of systems of innovation that got us those horizontal linkages across the economy, but even more so when we're thinking about really kind of pushing innovation to solve these challenges. If you start micromanaging the process and telling companies how to do it, when to do it, what to do, you might achieve something small, but you're not going to really fuel that kind of innovation-led growth. And so what I did in this little report that basically are the last couple slides of your slide deck was kind of reflect on this also for the European Commission, which had this big kind of pot of money, which currently is called the Horizon program. It's 100 billion euros, which might sound like a lot, but it's not if you divide by European GDP. So this is for innovation. And I basically argued that that bit of it, which was really focused so much on just this challenge-based thinking, why not, again, think through some of the mission-oriented lessons, like the ones I was just mentioning. But more specifically, I kind of broke it down into 5 criteria of, just to make sure they didn't end up calling missions anything they were already doing, because that's always a risk with any great policy idea, that it gets picked up, but then the status quo continues to happen. The first was, in terms of how you select these, to make sure it really is kind of bold, inspirational, and actually addressing societal relevance. But the first question you'll ask is, well, who decides what's relevant to society? Is it really that Kennedy moonshot, one guy and his friend saying, let's go to the moon and back again in a generation? Or how do you really get civic engagement and use new democratic structures also to engage people into that kind of decision-making of the big, again, challenges of our time? And you could actually say that the SDGs, if you look at the history of them, kind of went through that process. But I'm also inspired by what's happened in Germany in recent years, where if you look at the Energiewende, which is very much a mission in Germany to reduce kind of the carbon footprint of the country, again, forget whether it's perfect or not, I'm just talking about the attempts to get ambitious policies, would never have happened without 30 years of the green movement actually really bringing the sustainability kind of challenge to the core of government thinking, and then Merkel was able to sort of encapsulate it. But anyway, that's the first one. The second is a clear direction, targeted and measurable, so you can actually say yes or no, did we achieve it or not, which the simple space race challenge wouldn't have done. Similarly, the climate change challenge won't do, transforming these into concrete, targeted problems that you can actually say yes or no. Involving innovation, this great power of innovation that everyone talks about today, AI, big data, really using the power of these new technologies to address these problems, but realizing that those same technologies have historically actually also been an outcome of problem-based thinking. But the really important ones, I think, are the last two, the fourth being to make sure that the way you frame the missions themselves really will get you that cross-sector, cross-actor, by actor I mean public, private, third sector, and cross-disciplinary kind of investment and innovation. By disciplinary, I think this is really important for academia, because we've completely dismissed the humanities when we talk about kind of using science and innovation to address societal challenges. So poets could actually be quite useful to get these missions to be framed initially as inspirationally as they can be. And the fifth one, this notion of multiple bottom-up solutions. I mean, lots of the work that Danny has done on the importance of discovery processes, and I hear that you also had Sable here recently. I think some of his work could be understood also in terms of using emergence and discovery along the way. And then there's a whole chapter. I actually brought quite a few of these if you want to hold on to them. Let me just see now that I actually have these. Right, so these were those. I can just shut up and show you the slides. Right, so those are the 5 criteria. But the whole issue of how the hell do you actually then do this, implementing them. And this report, by the way, interestingly, has actually become law. Not bad. We do books and book talks, but this is now part of the legal framework. It was voted on, and this new report that we're writing called Governing Missions kind of breaks it down into these much more difficult questions, including how do you really make sure this doesn't get captured along the way. For me, at least, and I'll shut up in 2 seconds, for me, the really interesting thing about missions was how to use it really to reduce the probability that these bold policies get captured along the way. So how do you also make them conditional? Instead of picking winners, how do you pick the willing so that those firms that will be getting, as they do already, all these government handouts, subsidies, guarantees, loans, prize schemes are also doing so in order to achieve, if you want, a public objective. And one of the last slides I put there, but again, just use the slides as background information, was also on what does this mean literally for the deal, the contract, again, coming back to maybe Sable's discussion, for the actual contract between public and private. Why can't we think, again, boldly even about how to redesign those? Bell Labs, I'll literally finish with this point. Bell Labs, which you might have heard of because it was one of the most innovative R&D labs within a private company within AT&T, actually came from an era when government was much more confident about deal making. So for AT&T to retain its monopoly status, the agreement was they had to reinvest those profits back into the real economy, back into innovation, and innovation beyond just telecoms. And Bell Labs was, if you want, an answer to that deal. And the degree to which we don't have that today, you can also see in the aggregate figures of the level of hoarding that we have in the US and in Europe. In the US, it's over $2 trillion being just hoarded by businesses. The level of financialization, so over $3 trillion being used for share buybacks just in the last 10 years by the Fortune 500 companies. One could also interpret those as a lack of a proper deal, as well as the abuses of the patent system, et cetera. So I've gone over my time. I will shut up. You can look at my beautiful slides. And I assume... Oh, did I make you out of breath?
No, so that's wonderful. Thank you. Why don't I... let me start maybe by
asking you a little bit more about the relationship between your framework and the one. Can you speak up? I'm sorry, this doesn't.
Oh, you want mine?
I think I may have turned it off.
You should have worn a dress.
No, it's working. I wanted to ask you a little bit to start out just about your approach and the one that we heard from Chuck Sable last week.
That approach seemed to me to be focused much more on sort of very localized experiments across different types of collaborators, where the technological innovation and the outputs often are very serendipitous and not easy to plan beforehand. So that the objectives are often, for example, of these collaborations are defined in very loose terms because it's not possible to be very, very concrete about them. Those objectives get redefined through a process of iterative collaboration. And the role of the public sector and the government or state agencies is often to fill some of the holes in these networks to get more actors engaged by either providing missing particular inputs, investments in skill training or infrastructure or legal mechanisms that enable these contracts to expand. So I guess sort of one question in the back of my mind is yours sort of a complementary, or are we talking about different type of innovations, and you're really focusing on sort of these big sort of missions, cleaning up the oceans, for example, or attaining particular sustainable development goals, or is this something that's fundamentally at odds with sort of the version of his views
or your view?
I guess maybe my view as well.
Yeah, because you and I have had quite a few discussions. It's great when Danny's editing my paper. He's like, take that word. No, I'm kidding. So it's not at odds, but it's just different. And this is not, I should repeat, sorry if I went a bit rushed, but so this is not about pushing the technological frontier, about the high-tech areas of the economy. This is about ambition. So let me just give you a quick example before I answer the question. The BBC, it's not DARPA, but it's been really ambitious. Can you see me when I'm sitting? Yeah, right? I can stay seated. In 2014, I brought together all these different mission-oriented, in quotes, organizations, of which the BBC was one of them. And what I meant by that was that it has explicitly kind of pretended it's just fixing markets, but done much more. And it's really tried to shape and just change the broadcasting market. And in doing so, by being ambitious, it then ended up crowding in the private sector. And so I think there's different points there. One is that, one of the things it did, by the way, in the 1980s is they had the mission they had was to get every kid to code. This is back in the early 80s, right? Everyone's talking about coding now. And we were just talking about the greater importance of philosophical training for kids than coding. That was interesting. But they wanted every kid to code. And in order to do that, they needed a computer in every classroom. And so they basically commissioned and procured, which is interesting, by the way. The word procurement in some countries like Italy is like appalto, which is just actually like the contract, whereas procure is really nice because it's like a verb. You want something, right? So they wanted a computer in every classroom. And with that procurement policy, they ended up allowing basically the only real relevant high-tech company in the UK ever, Acorn, and then also ARM, to scale up, right? So instead of obsessing about startups, if you actually have, active and interesting public objectives, then you can use the power of procurement also to allow those cool new companies that can actually feed and procure what you're looking for, then actually to have a market and to scale up. And in fact, the history of US innovation has been very much that kind of scaling up through those public objectives. But coming back to what's the difference is that this actually also required an ambitious public actor, in that case, the BBC. It's different from then seeing the role of the BBC in just enabling, catalyzing, connecting different actors to do good things, which it also should do. It definitely should also do that. So when I say we shouldn't just need fixing markets, I also say we shouldn't just need the framework conditions, or in Europe we call it the horizontal conditions, right? What I see this as reframing what the vertical conditions are. So industrial strategies often has these kind of two components: horizontal conditions, which are also things like skills and education, which really needs a huge revamp as well as kind of different systems that need to happen, so particular institutions, and then vertical policies, which are when you actually make choices of what's to be done, right? And if that choice of what's to be done is just at that sectoral basis or the technological basis, it's too narrow. And so by using this concept of missions, I tried to sort of broaden it out, but on the economic theory side, the point is it actually requires different tools, different economic thinking, different tools for the practitioners, which I call market co-creating and market co-shaping, not just market fixing. And I do think that if we just talk about it as enabling, and all those words you said, which are important, then also the confidence, because I also see this on the ground, because I work, as you do, with policymakers worldwide, and there's also a level of lack of confidence and security. Literally, you know, I'm a value creator, I'm a risk taker, it doesn't matter, I screw up, but then I get up and do it again. You know, the venture capital industry loves saying how many times, you know, Kleiner Perkins, before they got the Genentech billion bonus, they screwed up along the way in biotech. That's considered a good thing. They're proud of how risk-taking they are. Have you ever heard of a civil servant saying, yeah, don't worry, we screw up, it's not a problem, we'll learn along the way? You know, front page of the Daily Mail the minute they screw up. So one thing is just going to psychotherapy and saying, don't worry, you can, you know, mess up. Another thing is to actually create a framework that actually prizes that rewards that level of experimentation, exploration, and learning within the public sector, not just within the private sector. And calling yourself a simple enabler and fixer doesn't get you there.
One of the key issues that we're trying to examine in this course is how can new technologies and innovations diffuse and disseminate through society, rather than, as in so many of the examples that you've cited, remain relatively locked up. And so looking at it from your perspective, how do I think about it? Do I think as this question of diffusion as a mission in and of itself? So do I define the problem as how do I create sort of a public program whose mission is to diffuse advanced technologies throughout the rest of society? Is that an appropriate mission? Or is the question of diffusion and dissemination is something that instead we ought to be building in to each one of our individual missions, everything from the oceans to SDGs to greening up the economy and all of that. But it's really ought to be part of those, but that's not a mission in and of itself.
Right. So, I mean, I came to all of this first through the innovation side, right? Actually understanding what, you know, kind of the economics of innovation side. And so diffusion and deployment is absolutely central. So understanding the economics of diffusion, economics of deployment is really important and is often kind of missed when we just try to build the silicon roundabouts in places like the UK. So first of all, when one of the slides there in the beginning has all the big general purpose technologies and the big kind of changes that have happened over the last 200 years, of which one was mass production, right? So mass production itself was a huge technological and organizational change. Just think of the whole Ford Model T kind of production structure and everything we know about those systems. It would not have affected the economies, because every economy in the world was basically affected by mass production, without suburbanization. So when people then moved to the suburbs in the US and in the West, that absolutely fueled the ability of all these mass-produced products, whether it was the cars being mass-produced, put off the assembly line, or the washing machines, the dishwashers, et cetera, to actually have a market. Now, what Carlota Perez and I have been doing in recent years is thinking, what's the equivalent of suburbanization today that could really be that kind of demand pull for ICT, for the ICT revolution, information computing and technology revolution. Because instead of doing the Gordon Solow thing, which they both have in different ways, done the same thing of putting up, is it mainly Gordon, the indoor toilet on one side and the internet there, and saying, which one? Which one would you get rid of if you had to? You know, the idea being the indoor toilet, indoor plumbing, electrification has had a huge impact on our lives, more than the internet, which both of them thought just hasn't really had the impact, and computers are everywhere, but in the productivity statistics, that old saying, it's sort of an unfair comparison, because what electrification had was that real sort of demand pull, which we haven't had. So one of the things we've been arguing is that green, and this also comes to the Green New Deal stuff, could actually be a complete redirection of the economy, on, especially not only on the demand side, which could also allow ICT to be really diffused and deployed throughout the economy, but also with that kind of directed purpose. And so what's interesting when we then look at this power of AI and big data that everyone talks about, it's very narrow where it's being applied. I mean, some areas like personalized medicine, wow, galore. You know, they've completely used the full power of big data to do that big change in the pharmaceutical industry. In other areas of the economy, and I would include almost the entire welfare state, almost, you know, very little use. But that's a political decision, or it's a decision of different actors. And so in the UK, we have something called the bedroom tax, which, you know, for social housing, how many bedrooms do you have? How many kids do you have? If one number is bigger than the other, you're out. You know, talk about negative complexity, like really simplistic algorithm. We could have, given the data we have on people living in social housing, unlike the data on rich people, which the Panama Papers revealed we knew very little about, we have that data, but we're just not using it to, again, really improve and innovate, organizationally innovate, as well as technologically innovate around certain arms of the welfare state. And this is where I think what's happening in Barcelona is really interesting. So Ada Colau, I don't know if you heard about this, she's the mayor of, do you say Barcelona or Barcelona? I say the Italian way. Who is kind of trying to rethink that relationship between the technology and the data that's generated and what's kind of good for citizens. And instead of seeing it kind of retrospectively, always with the state kind of trying to catch up when it's too late, just worrying about privacy, just worrying about tax, kind of thinking of it almost in a pre-distribution side, which is why have we set up the institution to be so problematic? What would it look like if every time you clicked on Citymapper, or whatever people click on in Boston, data that is generated actually comes back into some sort of public, which doesn't mean state, but think of it as collective, repository governed in a particular way. And we're working on this also with some AI people separately, where that data then gets analyzed and structured and brought together, you know, bringing together different people to actually improve public services, in that particular case, public transport. But that requires also institutions. But it's not the lack of technology, it's the lack of potential ambition through which that technology then diffuses throughout.
So if I understand you, you're right, and it's interesting that you're stressing more as a constraint the demand side, that if these new technologies aren't disseminating and diffusing throughout the rest of society, that it's largely because large parts of the economy don't have a demand for it. So the public sector largely, you know, could be part of this, but they're not because of the way that they're set up. Here, I think we've stressed a lot, perhaps a lot more, some of the supply side or the skills issue, which is that that large parts of the labor market are left on their own because they don't have the skills, the capabilities, and that's what we sort of, it's a different kind of take on.
Right. So I'll say just one quick thing, and then I think Roberto's trying to make us shut up so he can say something. I can tell he's going to.
No, I'm not getting
just one quick thing, and one has to do with Brazil. So on your last point, on skills, this comes back to my point about who sets the missions in the first place. I don't know if you're aware, and this might be someone good you could invite actually in your next version of the course, but the trade union movement globally, especially what's it called, the big, is it ETUC run by Sharon Barrows? They've come out with this concept of the just transition, which the idea is if there is going to be this big transition to a sort of a new type of economy that is also more sustainable, taking that kind of climate change urgency, you know, as a call for action, well, a lot of people are going to get left behind. So what are the new skills, et cetera? How do we make sure that, you know, businesses are also investing in that, and the public sector is too, so people, can transition in a just way. And I just think, again, that's a problematic way to think of the problem. The trade unions, in theory, along with other civil society organizations, as well as public and private, should be, but the question is how, and we need institutional changes for this, be at the table in the first place, even define what we mean by green, right? So how we define these things matter, because otherwise what happens is, even in the US, where there's huge amounts of health innovation spending, so the National Institutes of Health spend over $30 billion a year, what they're spending on, and this is a public entity, is overly about drugs. A colleague of mine calls it the pharmaceuticalization of the health industry. There's too much on drugs, too little on diagnostics, too little on surgical treatments, and almost nothing on healthy living. So they've accepted, even though it's an ambitious public agency, strategic, very mission-oriented, it's part of my entrepreneurial state story, they've allowed the industry to define the market in the first place. But coming back to the welfare point, one of the early studies that I started doing around, like when I started to get curious about exactly the question you're asking, we had a little case study done with Sebastião Loureiro. Do you know him? He runs a big public health program in the state of Bahia in Brazil, and he's a doctor running the school. And what they did was they wanted to better understand, and I think this is just a huge area of research that we should sort of go into, but they had a little case study, which is what is the relationship between the welfare state, how it's designed, and innovation. So one isn't just redistributing the other, the value creation, but how you design an ambitious welfare state through the different arms, which would include even the BBC kind of stuff, can affect the learning, the knowledge, and the innovation. So the arrows go both ways. And they had done an experiment on CAT scan equipment that before SUS, the public health system in Brazil, before that, the doctors were getting access mainly just to well-to-do patients. When a much broader group of patients had access to this public health system, that actually affected also the learning and the knowledge of the doctors themselves. And what they studied was the learning by doing and experimentation with this new population base. The CAT scan equipment, as it was getting diffused through the public health system, also produced new knowledge which fed back in. And even though that's a tiny little case study, if you think of it more broadly, how could we design a welfare state that really kind of fuels also innovation in the innovation state, as well as the innovation state itself be more mission-oriented to produce societally relevant outputs?
So my remarks are a reflection on the theme of transformative ambition, which I see really as the center of your project. And what I want to take as a point of departure for my little polemic is a tension that I discern between the connotation of transformative ambition and the denotation, the references of the examples, which go in the direction of technical problem solving, and a kind of scaling up or scaling out of technical problem solving. At the end of that road, what we would have would be technocracy for lefties, which is not really your aim. Right. And before developing that theme more abstractly, let me give two examples. So, first example is the development of the United States in the first half of the 19th century under the aegis of Alexander Hamilton's Project of National Development. So this was a vast project which had many moving parts, to be sure, some of them physical, like the building of canals and roads and then railroads, the distribution of the public lands, the organization of family-scale agriculture on the basis of cooperative competition among the family farmers and partnership with the governments, and the creation of new institutional devices like the public banks of the United States. And it had a social basis, which was in effect an alliance between the nascent financial plutocracy and the smallholding class. That's really what built the United States. And there was a massive mobilization of national resources, and there was sector-specific democratization of markets. especially in finance and in agriculture. The creation of a type of agricultural market and a type of financial market that had never existed before. Now, so this project was full of technical problems and solutions to them, but in no sense was it a technical project. It was an act of statecraft, of vision, that absorbed and transcended all of its parts. The whole was more than the sum of its parts. Now let me give you a second example. The situation of the Brazilian Amazon today is perhaps the single largest issue of environmental management and sustainable development in the world, in an area that is larger than Western Europe, with the largest tropical rainforest in the world, where essentially the only economic activities are in the cities. We have the free zone of Manaus, which produces cell phones and motorcycles that might just as well be produced in Hong Kong. They have nothing to do with the surrounding area. The only connection to preservation is the negative connection that the urban population is occupied. And then in the jungle, we have an artisanal activity of rubber tappers taking latex from the trees, which has no future, has no scale, it has no technology. It's a nostalgic sideshow. And then soy agriculture and low-intensity cattle grazing that is eating up the forest at the periphery. The fundamental problem is that there's no connection between the urban industrial complex and the green complex. And we would have to create that. So it has a technological element. Some of it is immediate, short-term. Almost all the forest technology available in the world evolved to deal with homogeneous temperate forests and not heterogeneous tropical forests. We would need to create a technology that doesn't exist. And some of it is more long-term, the development of medical science and technology to mobilize for medicinal purposes the biochemical wealth of the forest. Then there are technical issues of the provision of services, environmental services, in this vast area. And then to have that, we would need to provide services to the technicians who would provide those services. And no one knows how to do that in an area of continental size with a very sparse population. Then there are economic issues of creating the non-existing linkages between the urban industrial complex and the forest. And then there are legal institutional issues. Under what legal regime will we do all of this, other than thus the unilateral concession of vast areas of forest to big corporations? Now, once again, this is a problem which is full of specific technical difficulties requiring solutions. But it's not a technical problem. It's a large transformative project which could happen only if we created over time a constituency in the Amazon that does not yet exist. And that in turn would happen only if the country saw in the Amazon a chance to reinvent itself in a different way. So we've had this model of development recently of popularization of demand based on the production and export of commodities. And what we would need now would be a progressive approach to the supply side of the economy. And we would see the Amazon as an instance of this national project. So in these two examples that I just gave, the American example and the Brazilian example, it seems to me clear that we can't understand the problem as a scaling up of technical solutions. That's not what it's like. And in each case, the problem differs from technocracy and technical problem solving in the following ways. First, because it is enveloped in the ideological and programmatic disputes of real politics and real history. So it's clear with respect to the environmental debates. The dominant tendency of the first world environmentalism today is to represent itself as a kind of post-ideological or post-structural politics. History has disappointed us, and now we will seek in the great garden of nature a refuge in which to console ourselves against the disappointments of the historical world. And it's not like that. It's a way back into the ideological and structural disputes of the past, and not an evasion of them. A second characteristic is that the whole is more than the sum of its parts, and that all of the particular technical solutions to the technical problems are flawed, transient, a dime a dozen, and to be cast off. And it really doesn't matter so long as the direction persists. That is, it's like a current or a waterfall. The most penetrating comment made about Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal is that all of Roosevelt's programs failed, but the New Deal as a whole was a success. And the meaning is that we can't understand it the way that a technocrat understands it, as a grab bag of distinct solutions to discrete problems. It's a transformation in which we can't be fixated on our favorite solutions to anything, and all we care about is the fecundity and the direction. The third characteristic is that the direction always involves some change in the institutions, and in particular of the institutions of the market, as in the American example. The Americans didn't regulate the agricultural or the financial market. They developed a new kind of agricultural or financial market with a different legal constitution. And that would also be required in the Brazilian Amazon. And the fourth characteristic is that the project, the transformative project, is just the reverse side of a constituency that it builds. In other words, the constituency is not antecedent. It co-evolves with the project, as in these examples that I gave. And in all of those respects, this way of thinking is fundamentally at odds with a technocratic approach to social problems. One of the difficulties that we confront is that it's common in these debates to allude to the example of defense because of the great substantive significance of defense in radical technological innovation. But defense is a peculiar example with very special characteristics because it is the one that is least exposed to the ideological disputes. Projects like these can aspire to be hegemonic, but never to be consensual. And they cannot escape the ideological and political confrontation. Now, if we think in this way, if you accept this proposal that we abandon technocracy for lefties and instead develop a programmatic and structural way of thinking, the problem is that we can no longer rely on the established policy discourse and the existing social sciences, because they are all bereft of structural vision. They do not provide us with the instruments that we need to think in the way that I'm arguing is necessary. So I'd like to know whether you agree with me.
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
What I would call economics for the utopians.
Yeah.
So I agree with you, but I think that to fight that battle, you have to engage with some of these issues on the ground, which can look as if you're being technocratic, but at least, and I'm not saying this in a defensive way, but for me, the appeal of learning from the moonshot was just actually the ambition and the kind of economy-wide interaction. It was not on the technology itself. In fact, the misinterpretations of what happened, both in Silicon Valley and the moonshot, were precisely that kind of technocratic, for lefty kind of, tech for good now that people are also engaging with, including trying to get the financial community to finance it. So let me just say, technology for me is an outcome. I mean, so precisely because it's an outcome, it makes no sense to have a technocratic viewpoint. The question is, even with the because we have databases now, it's quite recent in capitalism, and we actually have lots of data to actually try to understand, well, what actually led to, again, particular solutions, whether it's medical or technological, et cetera. And if everything that was happening around it was much more important than what happened to come from it, including, it's very interesting with medicine that often the search for one thing leads to the discovery of something else, then the real question is, do we actually understand how these systems work, which then have led to, when they are well organized, to some, in some cases technological, other cases more organizational, other cases more social innovations. So the tech bit today, especially given that industrial strategies has come back, the appeal has been, let's think about quantum, quantum is the new thing, or AI and big data, and that's where we need to be focusing, and then applying it to sort of good stuff. But if you look at where AI itself came from, it itself came from problem setting. So then your question, in some ways one could interpret it as, are the questions I'm putting out there themselves a bit too technocratic, right? Too kind of narrow. And if you look at some of the stuff we've been doing around cities, and thinking about mobility, new ways that people actually move around a city, and why we just assume that it's just, the objective is to get from point A to point B quicker. That's not going to get us a new way to think about cities, sustainable cities, smart cities, et cetera. What we need is literally to come together through different types of actors to think, what do we even want from the city? What are the new types of institutions and structures to really get them to be achieving the kind of ambitions that we could be achieving by thinking about the social, the technological, and organizational. This issue about new institutions, I mean, when I said you also have to get sort of on the ground, one could say, yeah, but you're just revising like existing instruments, right? I mean, one could look at how we do procurement. Currently, it tends to be quite static, quite linear, it actually impedes innovation. We could, change that, right? We can use, again, procurement policy itself and prize schemes actually to really get different types of public, private, third sector actors to collaborate together to focus on particular solutions. That sounds easy, but actually it fundamentally changes how we are currently using procurement policy. So then unpicking what is really the bottleneck there. Is it just a lack of will? Is it structures that we could easily change from one day to another? What I've been arguing is that when you no longer even have an idea of what the state is for, when the word public value is not at the center of economics, it is sort of in business schools, but it's kind of this bastardized version of the term. When public purpose itself has kind of lost its way, it's actually impossible to really change procurement policy from how it's currently being used. So this kind of vision of, well, what is the public sector for in these public-private partnerships? And this issue of contracts, I mean, you say, all those things that happened from Hamilton to Roosevelt that were required, kind of new institutions. This wasn't just, tinkering with existing ones. I mean, public banks currently, for example, exist, and one could say we just need a different type of organization. But if you really used the power of public banks, which is to provide patient, long-term, committed finance for lots of different types of organizations that are, again, willing to work together in new ways to, on non-technological or sometimes technological, I don't think we should completely dismiss the tech bit, but social problems which could be around, care, social care. There's huge social care problems there that require new institutions. Public banks today are not fueling new types of collaborations in that space. But just saying we just need completely new institutions in some ways is I don't want to say a cheap shot, but it doesn't actually also allow us to radically shift the way that some of these institutions, I mean, the US, to be honest, doesn't have a public bank. There is one, I guess, in North Dakota somewhere. But rethinking what a public bank is for. So the work we're doing in Scotland is actually setting up a public bank from scratch and saying, make sure it doesn't have a sectoral focus. That's not your role to simply hand out money to firms and sectors. It's to be linked up with some sort of vision, that higher level vision of what Scotland's going for example, around inclusive growth. Bring together different people in society around the inclusive growth agenda, and then transform your public bank to really provide that patient finance to enable these higher risk, difficult problems to be financed.
So,
I mean, what's the technocratic bit?
Yeah, so the setting of the setting of this vision, the mission has to come from, the idea of a mission has to come from somewhere, and it's always a result of a political battle. So you're not saying anything else. The setting of the mission, if tomorrow we decide to...
It's that the idea of the moonshot seems to me to be a dangerous example.
If I understand
So
you
that's
correctly, so that seems to give it, because it's some bureaucrats decide. But if tomorrow we're going to decide to have a Green New Deal or something fundamental in changing our climate policies, it'll have to come as a result of a hard-fought political battle. It'll have to be somebody providing a credible and politically appealing vision of who and what we want to be, and getting sufficient political support for that.
Yeah, but what's at stake are the habits of mind and the modes of action. So a common way of thinking of politics and policy, it's what I'm calling technocracy, is there is a heap of discrete problems, loosely connected, and there are then better or worse solutions to those discrete problems, as opposed to the idea that every society in its historical circumstance confronts a choice of directions, and that there's a cumulative sequence going in one direction or another, and that the treatment of the particular problems is entirely subsidiary to this choice of directions. That is, the directions are created by the way in which they face these problems, but the understanding of the directions cannot be reduced to the simple collection of the technical solutions to the discrete problems. It leads you in a different direction.
What do you mean by technical?
It's just a means-ends problem in which there's no issue about the framework, the underlying interests and ideals, the constituencies that can and should be developed, and so forth. What I call the real stuff of history. That's what it's really about. And there is this intellectual disconnection to which I referred at the end of my remarks, that we really don't have ways of thinking about this, because the large ideas that influenced our ways of thinking, like Marxism, have ceased to be believable and are vitiated by a series of deterministic illusions. And then the technical social sciences and policy discourse are, on the whole, empty of structural vision. So we are betrayed by the ideas that are available to us and the vocabulary that they embrace into this way of thinking. And so I think to me, this was clear in your presentation. The spirit of your presentation is the spirit of transformative ambition. But the vocabulary and the characteristic intellectual moves are all imported from this world of the established social sciences and the policy discourse. And the examples, like the moonshot, are examples which lead in this direction of that's something we can agree on. And
so maybe I should just stop talking about the moonshot, because the only reason I begin with the moonshot is that it was a very difficult feat that would have never happened, literally never happened, had it not been done in a very disruptive way, which was to get lots of different sectors in the economy together and fundamentally transforming how government was working, literally its tentacles. And then the idea is then, instead of just using it for technocratic kind of areas, what would it look like if we actually then applied it to, again, the SDGs as challenges, not missions, which are all basically social. They're all these, again, wicked problems, which means that they require behavioral change, political change, regulatory change. It's not just a technological feat. And what I argue is it fundamentally requires new economic thinking in what government is for and how government is structured, but especially how public and private come together. In this issue that you mentioned about conflict, I mean, the reason I brought up the German example is when I say the Green Movement for 30 years fought for sustainability, there was conflict there. It wasn't easy. So how, do we actually have government capabilities and structures that are able to listen to, understand, and engage with these different actors, which I say need to be at the table in the pre-distribution, not the post-distribution way, to even define the green transition? The answer is no, they're scared of conflict. Everyone's scared of conflict.
Now,
so that requires new
There's
structures.
a theme that Danny brought up, which is very interesting, which shouldn't get lost in this conversation, which is the question of the relation of demand to supply. So there's this literature of the business schools about disruptive innovation. And the concept of the disruptive firm, which deploys capital-intensive, radical innovation on the supply side, but on the demand side also creates demands that never existed for products that are new in markets that haven't been organized yet. So it operates the firm on both the demand and the supply side. It does that in a society in which the state has not solved the problem of coordinating breakthroughs on the demand side and the supply side. So in its little micro world, it transforms the failure of the state into an opportunity for profit. And then one would say, following that line of argument, that we need a political economy that at the macro level does what the disruptive firm is trying to do at the micro level. And so that's another example of how the discussion would become larger.
But I would argue that firms
technical.
have learned how to do that, actually, historically, from copying the state. I mean, this, just setting up the welfare state was incredibly disruptive. It was not just difficult, but it then created demand in all sorts of different areas. You could argue, one of the ways to also talk about the Green New Deal is that you can either do that really defensively and focus on all the things that shouldn't be done in order to limit, carbon emissions, et cetera, or you really create a new vision for all the funky things that could be done, fundamentally changing how citizens engage again with the city. And in some ways, if you look at what's happening around the world, even just within Europe, there's very, very different ways in which the state is or is not creating, if you want, disruption in that green space. So in Denmark, where they had really interesting city-level policies, like in Copenhagen, that required then the startup community, which everyone kind of obsesses about usually on its own, to actually provide certain types of interesting services that the city itself was calling for, and that has resulted in Denmark today being the #1 provider of high-tech green services to China's green economy, and China's spending 1.7 trillion on greening its economy. Again, one could say, though, that's a really narrow way of thinking of the problem, but hey, this is in an era where so many different countries have both their startup, attempts, as well as talking about green, but what it actually means for the state to be on the demand side, saying we want fundamentally different types of streets, of ways in which citizens engage in a public realm. So a public square isn't public just because you walk into it, it's also public because of the experience. So Google isn't public because it's free. It's a private enterprise, obviously. What does it mean for a city to really rethink its public space and redefine the public realm, and in doing so, require sort of different types of, again, services, meetings, interactions, collaborations? I think what's interesting, again, is that ends up fueling also an innovation economy. It becomes a cool place to go if you are a young again, startup that wants to be in that area of work, you go to Denmark today, even though then companies come and go. If a better tax scheme happens somewhere else, those places that are able to create a hub of new thinking around a space. But then it's really interesting to look at what the state had to do to even be a puller, if you want, of some of these. And that's why I think it's interesting to see also some of the critiques that people have made of the smart city kind of strategy, to what degree that smartness itself, again, has been defined by a limited way of thinking of tech, as opposed to fundamentally changing how people are living in cities.
So we give the class a chance.
Yep. Why don't you take the question?
Oh, okay. So what do I do? Just point to people? Bruno.
Thank you very much. My question has to do with the developing countries. How can you transplant this to developing countries? Is there some certain level of preconditions that need to exist in developing countries in order to do these mission-oriented policies? And because most of the examples that you have given, both in your paper and here, are from developed countries. So do you know of any successful examples?
Do you do one by one? Yeah. So in the same way that I think cities are really interesting places to look, because there's really concrete problems, but there's ways to frame those problems very narrowly versus more interestingly, ambitiously, that then would require the solutions to come from different parts. I think developing countries similarly have lots of really concrete problems with also a sense of urgency. Urgency, by the way, with the wartime scenarios, which were kind of just tech fixes, did matter. It kind of makes you sometimes abandon, oh, do we have the money or not? You just got to solve the problem. So I'd say in developing countries, what they have going for them is also that sense of urgency, where the problems are very, in some ways, clear. They also have to do with some basic stuff that we take for granted in developed countries. But the really interesting thing is, how do you then frame that urgent, concrete problem in a wide enough way? Even something like a cancer mission in a developed country could be framed really narrowly, that just brings in the health sector, or broadly that brings in all the preventative stuff, which require nutrition, mobility, et cetera. So in a developing country, if you're looking at problems which have to do with even getting to the technological frontier, forget the technology for a second, but just getting to the frontier of development, then if you could use that as opportunities to frame missions, whether it's around the problems of, again, education, whether it's around the problems of hygiene, whether it's around the problems of, it depends just if you're talking about low income or middle income. But so what we've been trying to do, we went to Africa actually recently for the Ibrahim Governance Weekend, where the whole thing is actually on governance and how to also make sure we have the right mechanisms through which to govern the processes within the state, let alone what the state is for. What was interesting was that the feedback I was getting was that we have no lack of problems. Of course, we can use this kind of mission-oriented thinking quite clearly, because again, the missions would be quite clear, and yes, we can think about all the different solutions we might need, et cetera. But that they are some of the places that have been most fed this idea of policy, making sure that it does not get too ambitious. Why? Because of the risk of, for example, corruption. So in Africa in particular, but I'm going to say I'm from Italy, where I feel like we invented corruption. We've taught people how to do it, so I'm like, it's us. That almost becomes the most constraining bit, which is that when you no longer believe in the state, look at Brazil recently, when the state itself has been under so much attack, let's just say for corruption reasons, for ways that it's become captured by private interests, how do you resurrect this idea that the state has any legitimacy in kind of claiming what's relevant for society? And I think that's the biggest bottleneck. It's not that sort of level of development, because So then the question is what to do. And so this is where I think we get this self-fulfilling prophecy, which just makes things worse. I mentioned in Italy, and I wasn't joking, Italy, which has had such problems of corruption, when recently they did their public sector reform, it had, none of these issues sort of came up. It really was a question of making sure the state even became less ambitious, precisely because it gets captured, not take up too much space, just literally facilitate, and then allow most of the solutions then to come through the private sector. So it basically ended up just cutting even more the state. So salaries of teachers are hardly high in Italy. Instead of kind of rethinking how could we bring a more, I don't like the word meritocratic for reasons that Michael Young argued, but still more talent into the state, make it less nepotistic? How do you actually really, again, welcome uncertainty and create learning organizations within the state where this process of experimentation that we talked about is almost one of the driving forces to find out better policies than in places that have been so affected by corruption? It's even harder to make that leap. And I don't know if some of the work that you've done on discovery and industrial strategy as a process of discovery, if you found that it's been easier in developed countries than in developing countries. But I think that lack of, when you no longer believe in the state, what happens is you also no longer believe in its ability to learn, to be dynamic, to be creative, where these adjectives I just used could, if well structured, be forces against corruption. And so again, I've seen just Italy in the last 10 years become even more problematic in terms of nepotism.
So one, I mean, you've talked.
But it's not lack of challenges. It's not the lack of missions. Sorry, it's more the ideological.
So one issue is you know, is the whole corruption and capture. The other is just the pure effect of ability to carry out. So I can decide I'm going to be following this, and I'm not worried about corruption. But in Africa, I can barely collect my taxes. I can't get students to show up at school. So it's just a effectiveness issue.
But those capabilities, I think, I mean, to be honest, those capabilities that you just mentioned, how to do that, there's kind of textbooks about that. What we don't have textbooks for is the other issue that was being raised by Roberto, which is if you are going to have a directional push, if you're going to fundamentally say we're going to change the type of economy we have, the type of society, because you're not just talking about the economy, how do you do that, right? So if a green transition is just about renewable energy and just about offshore wind within that, it's obvious how to do that. If it's actually about setting a direction, which is open enough for lots of different possibilities, hence my point about the multiple solutions, but it's still directed. You still want to solve concrete problems, but in a way that really is fueled by bottom-up experimentation. What does that literally mean for how the state understands risk-taking? How the state thinks about its role as both investor first resort, which historically it has had to be in order to crowd in the private sector, but with a portfolio that is wide enough to not just end up being put all your eggs in one basket. And so, I often give the example in the US of Tesla and Solyndra, which were both investments made at the same time when Obama initially wanted to direct the stimulus package. 800 billion was what the stimulus package was in the US. Initially, he really kind of set the stage before the whole Tea Party thing happened for it to be directing the US economy towards green. And that required actually making choices, picking winners, meaning picking particular companies. It wasn't just generic infrastructure. And he didn't have a narrative. He didn't have an explicit portfolio-making process, but he actually was making bets here and there. But because they didn't have the ability both to talk about it, but literally on the ground to make sure that they weren't just socializing risks, but also rewards, which itself is a capability. I mean, that's a capability. Like VC guys, again, have capabilities. They study how to make the investments and how to think of their reward mechanisms, how to think about redistributing them, reinvesting them along that risk landscape. At best, what the US state did was just fund stuff and then kind of weren't able to see it through, to the point that they actually said to Tesla, if you don't pay back the loan, we get 3 million shares in your company. And why would you want 3 million shares in a crappy company that doesn't pay back the loan? So the taxpayer ended up bailing out Solyndra, getting nothing out of Tesla and getting pretty pissed off in the process, and then you fall back to the usual, don't pick winners, just do the background infrastructure.
So just to complement what you're saying, there are two contentious issues. So the first is, how should we understand the relation among three agendas of construction of the state associated with different centuries? So there's a 19th century agenda of professionalism in civil service. There's a 20th century agenda of effectiveness in public administration and performance assessment. And there's a 21st century agenda of experimentalism. And it is common to think that these agendas have a linear relation to one another, that you need to finish one before you begin the other. And it can't be that way. Because the reality in these countries is that all three agendas have to be advanced simultaneously. Now, the second point of contention is whether you take the position of some of the well-intentioned reformers that the construction of the state is an antecedent condition for the reorientation of political economy. So they say, it's the mother of all reforms. Do this first before you discuss the substance. And it can't be that way either, because no country reforms its state and its politics in order later to decide what to do with the reform state and the reform politics. The reform of the state happens only in the midst of the struggle. It happens only when it needs to happen.
Yeah, Hirschman
And so there has to be this dialectical relation between the struggle over the redirection and the construction of the state.
Yeah.
And I think that I would argue is the right solution to those two decisive problems.
So the person who wrote most interestingly, besides yourself, on this is Hirschman, Albert Hirschman, on the hiding hand, no? the hidden hand, what's it called? The something hand.
The paradox of something.
Of the hidden hand, yeah, where you basically
something about paradox.
both talking about that directive, the need for the state to direct, but also to use the crises, which in the developing world were much greater, as opportunities to rethink itself constantly, to rethink its policies, its instruments, and learn along the way, and crises as opportunities to shift. And one of the implementation issues I put before is, again, without celebrating the moonshot itself, at the organizational level, that ability to pivot, that ability to be adaptive and flexible was in fact one of the key characteristics, is still, of DARPA. DARPA being able to both, first of all, appeal to the top people to want to work inside the state, which can only really happen if you do have some sort of transformative ambition. So Steve Chu would have never, he's a Nobel Prize winning physicist, would have never agreed to direct the DOE had Obama just said, oh, we need you to come in here to help us do feed-in tariffs and carbon taxes. He really, Obama, at least initially, when he was trying, basically brought him in to apply to the kind of green area, the ambition thinking that had happened that got us the kind of IT revolution. And then at the organizational level, that ability to kind of set up a portfolio, to really take the risks, to the point that Cheryl Martin, the head of ARPA-E, said we actually evaluate ourselves within ARPA-E by how much risk we were willing to take and how much economy-wide impact our successes have. So in other words, we're not there just to create gadgets. But that, I think, is susceptible to that technocratic point, which is this really just about technology, or is it fundamentally rethinking the institutions, of which DARPA and ARPA-E maybe were of the past, and maybe we need something in the future. But I think it's more how these organizations come together that need to be rethought. And I see this in space today. The space economy, literally outer space, is an area where all these private companies are now going into, and we're not learning the lessons of what has failed in the past in terms of building pretty parasitic public-private partnerships in areas like health. What does it really mean to create, and this is where I go back to the contracts issue, a symbiotic, mutualistic, dynamic, creative form of partnership between public, private, and increasingly third sector, especially in those areas. And we're actually repeating the worst forms of the mistake on space. So Novartis is working for free and patenting on the International Space Station. These, space tourism itself is getting huge amounts of public money, but for no clear public benefit, which would be fine if it was really completely fueled by the private sector. But given the huge amounts of public money going in, for what? And not just really thinking through what does it mean to both co-direct, but also to really share the rewards, not just monetarily, but in the conditions that are in place so that citizens really benefit from these investments. And I think that's where the opportunity to rethink things. Yeah, you should point.
This is very interesting. I find it very compelling, your arguments.
Could you speak more loudly, please?
I find it very compelling, but I feel like one of the main pushbacks, particularly on the green case, would be that the fixing market failures approach hasn't actually been tried.
Yeah.
That no one's really had a carbon tax of any significant size. No one's really provided even the background infrastructure and the basic research, besides a bit of work from ARPA-E, as you mentioned, in recent years. And so, is it that the failure of the fixing market failures approach was the substance of the approach, or that it just failed to build a political consensus and enough dynamism around the political messaging to actually get it done?
That's a good point, and I think this comes back to some of the conversations I've often had with Danny. So for me, it's definitely not to throw it out. It's very useful, and I would argue, actually, exactly as you have, that it itself, even though it's narrow, hasn't been pushed to its extreme in terms of actually really funding the public goods, really correcting for the negative externalities. So in fact, even just with feed-in tariffs and carbon taxes, which would be the negative externalities, they kind of come and go. They're not well structured. They don't, create certainty for business investment, et cetera. So you could kind of go through all the market failures and show gaps. But I don't think, and this comes to an essential point, almost more in my previous work in the entrepreneurial state, more than in the missions, I don't think there's a justification for the structural composition at the organizational level of the ARPA-Es through a market failure approach. There's no real, and this comes to the capacity and capability. It's not just at the level of what form of capabilities do we need, but even literally investing in-house in your own knowledge, which both the BBC and DARPA actually have done. The reason the BBC continues to attract so many top journalists who want to work for the BBC, unlike in many countries where public broadcasting is not so attractive, and I would say both in the US and in Italy, it doesn't necessarily get the best journalists. In the US, because literally public broadcasting has at best just fixed the market failure problem. The BBC, every time it's reviewed, they try to apply a market failure framework to it. They say, okay, it's fine to make documentaries about giraffes in Africa. It's fine to make high quality world news, but why are you doing soap operas and talk shows? That's not a public good problem. Leave that to business. And that's a perfect example of what I'm talking about. It's actually been because the BBC was willing and able and kind of resisted, partly because people love it so much that they weren't able to kill it, and they anyway went after the soap operas and the talk shows, and in that space transformed it. That's what I mean also by transforming. Literally redefine what public broadcasting does, and the kind of soap operas also, like EastEnders trying to push through public messages or whatever. Forget whether we like EastEnders or not. But through a market failure approach, you would never have even the justification for the BBC to do that. And yet it's because it did that that it's successful. It has more than 50% market share. It has a confidence of also creating quite, at least more so in the past, deals with the private actors that it works with. And my point is quite simple, that the market failure approach is limited in its way, both to talk about that more system-wide transformation, but also the degree of investments you need to make in-house in order to, again, actually co-create and co-shape markets in this more mission-oriented way.
So can I ask a counterfactual? What do you think would have happened if there'd been, what do you think would have happened if there'd been a $40 a ton carbon tax since 2000 or 1990 worldwide?
But this comes to the technocratic point. If the green transition was simply solar panels and wind, then that would have created a big revolution. If the green transition actually requires what we know has been required in previous big shifts, things that go beyond the technology fix, then that wouldn't have been enough. So again, coming back to diffusion and deployment, that demand side pull would not have necessarily happened in terms of diffusion throughout the way that businesses operate, how households behave, how they intersect, requires other things beyond just people investing in more solar.
But even if you're thinking in very narrow market failure terms, it can't just be a carbon tax, because so we agree that carbon tax has to be part of it, because you have to give producers and consumers the right price signals. So that, give them a price where they're fully internalizing this externality. But that's not the only externality that we're talking about, because it's quite clear that any R&D that's going to be done that reduces the cost of substituting away from dirty technologies is generically full of spillovers, externalities. So we have another big area of externality, which is associated with green technologies. So then that's going to be something else, a component that you want to think about. Now, some of that might be R&D subsidies, tax credit, but the more you think about it, then you realize that this is actually an area with huge amount of uncertainty. When you get into sort of multidimensional uncertainty of this kind, then the usual Pigovian approach of just provide the subsidy at the margin that matters doesn't begin to solve the problem anymore. So you have to think in much broader terms, and that's, I think, where in fact, if you think in those broader terms, you might start to come closer to an, sort of a DARPA or ARPA-E kind of an approach to this, because it's really meant to solve a broader problem. We know that there are huge externalities associated with frontier technologies. We don't exactly know where the solutions are. That has to be, sort of part of the process of discovery, and what the government is going to be doing is essentially setting out these broad challenges and then trying to get these coalitions of the willing to do things. It's, I can justify purely from a kind of an externality standpoint, but in the concrete case, where the nature of the externality and technological possibilities are subject to very high dimension externality.
But that's an example. Yes.
Let me finish. But the reason I'm saying this is not to debate the point about whether market failure is an appropriate way or not. I'm just want to carry this story through to see where it takes us. So we started from sort of trying to solve the problem. So we have carbon tax. We have something that sort of extends into something like an R&D innovation, industrial policy to crowd in these technologies, frontier green technologies. Then we start thinking, okay, what is that going to be doing to who gets what? The moment you start thinking about all the structural changes that these sort of new technologies and the carbon tax is going to create, then you're going to say, well, I want to ensure that people are not going to be left behind. So that means that there's going to be lots of losers from the carbon tax. That might be sort of particular categories of workers, particular communities. Then necessarily I'm going to start thinking about what all the job and labor market implications of all of these things are, and that's going to be completely sort of yet a third area of institutional innovations that I would have to think about. So I don't want to, defend, sort of the Green New Deal or anything like that, but I'm just saying you can back out something like that from, and let me call it not market fixing or market failure approach, which is not the one I want to defend, but back it out from a technocratic approach. So I want to come back to this notion of technocracy and defend technocracy a little bit, because I think we were too quick at dismissing it. And I just don't know how you would think seriously about these interlocking elements of a problem like this without applying social science. And so I think that's largely really a problem, a question for
which social science? So
I gave you examples of social science
so I think that your example, your discourse just now, illustrates the problem, because you were pressing the concept of externality into a service that it cannot render. You were stretching the concept of externality into a discourse regarding bets about the future, which is the line of economic transformation that has the greatest promise for the future. That's a whole different deal intellectually. And there we need an idea of the structural transformation of the economy and the options available to it. So it's not that this established discourse is useless. It's very useful in its logical rigor, in its clarification of trade-offs and constraints. What it is singularly inapt for is the discussion of structural change and the alternatives for the future. And that's not a condemnation of it. It's simply an observation of its inadequacy to the purpose of transformative ambition.
So let's be clear about what we're agreeing and what we're
Yes.
disagreeing on, because I'm not so sure. So again, I'm perfectly happy with my market failure analysis, but that's not the one that I want to defend. What I want to defend is the technocratic approach, which I think encompasses some of the things that you said Mariana was engaging in, because I want her as
an ally. Just when I.
So my question is, let's go back to the New Deal example. You need some way of thinking about how some of these approaches are going to work. And I think what you
Yeah.
said that, whether they work or not is immaterial to, the general predisposition of what was at stake. I don't think that can possibly be right. Because if they do not work, then you don't get to see.
Of course.
So the question becomes, what are the tools that you have at your disposal to figure out whether something is working or not? And there, everything from evaluation to monitoring to thinking about the various incentive effects, it's going to be a bunch of technocratic stuff.
No.
No.
No, I don't agree. Take the New Deal example. So in the first stage of the New Deal, which was the early stage of institutional experimentalism, a year and a half really, the predominant theme was the restabilization of the economy under corporatist ideas of concerted action between government and big business. This was a fatal option. It was an option made to the detriment of another direction, which would have been the democratization of opportunities. Because Roosevelt was under the influence of the then predominant ideas in the world, which were corporatist. And then in the second stage, that focus of corporatist restabilization narrowed even further to the provision of safeguards against economic insecurity. Now, those are crucial options, in the making of which a simple means-end schema of technocratic analysis doesn't provide the outcome.
So I think you're largely describing the ends. You're describing what the sort of objectives in terms of what kind of an economy we want. What is the structure we want? I'm 100%
No, but it's not just about that. It's the diagnosis of the problem. It's the diagnosis of the problem. They made a diagnosis of the problem, that the problem was instability and the solution was restabilization.
But your critique of his, I think, is the Schumpeter critique. Schumpeter said that in order to understand capitalism, you have to understand innovation, and yet we have a model of perfect competition that you have to talk about imperfect competition in order to talk about innovation. So we actually need the core way we understand the structure of the economy should actually be encompassing these key attributes, which in his case was innovation. So what you're saying is if you need to talk about externalities, to talk about things that are actually about the core of the system.
So in other words, there's an analysis of how the economy works.
Exactly.
And the question is, in this analysis, how much must be taken for granted about the framework, the institutional and ideological framework? The more that's taken for granted, the more superficial our analysis of the workings of the economy becomes. Because to understand how it works, you have to understand how it might work in some adjacent space. Otherwise, you don't understand it.
But the idea that FDR thought that the main constraint to the superior functioning of the U.S. economy in 1933 was from would have been alleviated through the imposition of a kind of a corporatist structure of the way that he anticipated, that he wanted at the outset. That was not based on any contemporary thinking, and there wasn't a technocratic notion that he just took from the day's literature.
No, I'm not saying it was technocratic.
In fact, Keynes at the time said that this was wrong. That Keynes' view was that his preoccupation with these corporatist structures at the outset was a sideshow. He was wasting his time with it. And then what he ought to be doing was doing a lot more of the fiscal expansion and aggregate demand management that he had started to do. And ultimately, that was critical. And had he done more of it, as Keynes argued at the time, maybe the New Deal would have been even more successful earlier on without needing the war.
But I didn't accuse Roosevelt of being technocratic. He thought programmatically. He thought programmatically in a way that was flawed and limited by the dominant ideological conceptions of the time. But that's what was at stake. And it's nothing that could be understood in the language of the moonshot. It's not because he chose the wrong moonshot, so to speak. It's because he had the wrong understanding of the economy and its structural possibilities. Keynes also, I think, had the wrong understanding, but that's another conversation.
But this term, possibilities, for me at least, is the answer to yours, that last question you said about the carbon, had we had the perfect kind of carbon pricing. So, and I always cite Warren Buffett for this. He's like, stop screwing around with my tax. I don't even look at it. I only invest when I see a possibility. I only invest when I see an opportunity. So for me, at least, part of this has been about what can the public sector do when it's really driven by public value and public purpose to transform that opportunity space, the possibility set, which actually then gets the private sector to be like, ooh, wow, damn, I'm going there, Because actually, if you look at the history of tax incentives in the innovation world, whether it's patent boxes or R&D tax credits, they're hardly effectual. They don't actually make businesses invest in R&D that they wouldn't have anyway. What does that is, and I don't always want to go back to the public spend because it's not just about public, but some sort of ambitious plan. That was the point of the Denmark example I gave before, which with the same amount of money, you can do it in an interesting way, with vision, with inspiration, same amount of money in a boring way that thinks that you can just do a bit of tax credits and infrastructure and a bit of innovation spend. What do we know? Again, developing countries, developed countries, different types of areas, health, education, et cetera. What actually made things tick that got other actors to be like, all right, I'm going into that space. And then you can devise an interesting tax incentive on top of that, but my experience is that that affects the marginal spend, exactly how much you might invest, but it doesn't actually make you invest in areas you were like, that's too scary, that's too weird. And that's where these organizations, the DARPA-type organizations around the world, that would include CITRA in Finland, the YASMAs in Israel, et cetera, which actually wasn't just public money, but public money with a vision which was stepping outside of just fixing an existing problem in a well-defined market, but transforming that definition of the market in the BBC way, got then the private sector to come in. And again, with the BBC, you just look at what it's done. The private broadcasting organizations have constantly been crowded into new spaces that the BBC was able to kind of lay the groundwork for, which it would have never done had it followed the Charter Review. Go back to your documentaries, go back to your high theater or ballet, whatever it is PBS does here, as great as it is. When I'm here, I watch PBS all the time, but it's tiny market, 0.05% of the population watch it.
Because ballet has externalities.
Sorry?
Ballet has
Yeah.
externalities. Let's take two questions, over there and over here. Let's go in the back.
Thanks. So I want to ask, I know we don't have much time, but I want to ask a little bit about central banking. So there's this prop here, Christine Zahn, who has this really interesting work on sort of the history of money creation and what legal institutions were in place to make different models of currency and how that affects economies as a whole. And our current model, was really invented by the British, the central bank model. Originally was the national bank, cooperating with commercial banks to release credit, and that credit is tax receivable and becomes money. And I think it's inspiring research, and it's very interesting because it shows really the creation of markets as a governance decision and a political one. And it was created at a time in England when there were a series of crises and civil wars and wars. The government was defaulting on its debt constantly, and they were just trying to invent new ways of making money, and they came up with a whole bunch of them. And this is just the one that stuck, right? So I think it has a lot of resonances with the kind of talks we've had in this class. One thing that bothers me about this research, however, is that as inspiring as I find it, I also find it makes me feel a little depressed sometimes, because I think of all the public spaces scared of innovation, I don't think central banking and financial services, I don't think there's anybody more scared of innovation than that group. Think about what happened after the financial crisis. Basically, tripled down on technocracy. There was no real evaluation of the system and the boom and bust cycle that might be caused by it, or economic inequality, or who banks loan to, or any of that. It was just, let's come up with another 20 or 30 technocratic developments to regulate more and more, finely, all these aspects of it. And so I know you talked about a public bank in Scotland. I think public banking is one interesting thing, but even that usually is kind of a small approach. I'm wondering, how is it you nurture experimentation and vision in an area that is so fundamental to the economy that everyone's afraid of messing with? How do you nurture a space where you can actually think of or even model? Like, I'm not sure how you can model this kind of thing. Different forms of currency creation. And if you can't, I wonder, how do you really make a more equitable economy? I don't know. So that's my question for you, for actually the whole panel. It's come up a lot today.
Let's take the other one.
I'm imagining going back to India where I'm from. I'm imagining going back to India where I'm from and trying to convince the political system to like adopt like large missions, right? And like you can think of multiple missions which a country as big as India might adopt. You can think of like resettling the population, greening more as a way to fight climate change. You can think of like river interlinking to get rid of arid areas, whatever. There's an infinite amount of like national projects you could imagine which would drain the country's resources and stretch it to its limits. How would one go about evaluating which one of these to do? And I don't think it's a sufficient answer to say let the political system decide, because finally in our capacity as citizens we still need to have some ways of thinking about it. And this is a question to Professor Hoover as well. If nothing we know is enough to evaluate any of this, then how do we even decide which direction to go?
So just quickly on the money, I think it also depends what you think money is for. And there's very different, if it's just a medium of exchange or if it's the kind of MCM prime Marx thing. So what's interesting is that money, so Marx said it's MCM prime, it's not CMC. So money's not there in the middle of how commodities trade. Actually, capitalism is fundamentally a debt-driven monetary system. So understanding your question is key. Now, but I'll take the opposite stance, which is, if anything, one could argue there's been lots of interesting thinking, lots of innovation in the financial sphere, but it hasn't been linked up with the real economy. So if you look at even all the QE, which is the old stuff, kind of coming from that old central bank kind of role that you were mentioning, trillions were plowed into the system. It ended up back into the financial system itself. But that's not because it was badly devised itself, is that it only works when you're also, coming back to the previous point, using fiscal stimulus in ways that really expand the pie, that isn't just creating roads and bridges and kind of infrastructure, interest rates are low, so let's go build more infrastructure. If you can, big if, do kind of, what I'm calling for around this mission-oriented stuff around the social problems and really fuel using industrial strategy, innovation policy to expand the pie, then this expansion of the monetary system and the plowing in of literally trillions of dollars in the US, for example, gets pinned onto these new areas that you're creating. Now, does that actually require new financial innovation, new innovation in finance, or does it require an expansion of how we think? Finance and the real economy are interlinked, and that if you're just expanding one without the other, you just fuel another bubble. But what does it then really mean to use your fiscal stimulus to direct new imaginary spaces as opposed to just fund, again, zero interest infrastructure? To me, that's more the question. I mean, having said that, I don't know anything about bitcoins and stuff like that, so I'm sure someone who just studies that would give you 1,000 other possibilities of what the financial system could be innovating in. But at least in my world, even at the micro level, this idea that you need more finance is not true. There's plenty of finance, different forms of finance. What there isn't is things to finance. There's not as many great, interesting projects to finance. Plenty of money and different forms of money.
Just to clarify, I wasn't talking about innovation in finance. I was talking about innovation in money creation.
In money creation.
The institutions that design and disperse money through an economy and then make it collectible and act as legal tender. I don't think there's innovation in that space.
Let me just say that we will be getting into sort of monetary and fiscal policies in our next two sessions, and Raghu Rajan in particular
perfect.
will be a very good
Great.
person
So he'll give you the good
to
answer.
ask that question, I guess, in maybe 2 or 3 years. You say something about
On evaluation. So
picking.
well, I think there's 2 issues on evaluation. One is, once you've picked a mission, regardless of whether it's right or wrong, how do you evaluate it? And we're working now with the Treasury, so not the central bank, but the Treasury in the UK, unpicking their green book. There's this green book that they use actually to evaluate not just the BBC's, but any public investment. And it's just full of things like net present value, cost-benefit analysis, et cetera, which even within a market value framework would probably be limited, let alone in this more ambitious transformative agenda. So the question is, for example, just forgive me if I go back to the moonshot, even if they hadn't gotten to the moon, pretend they failed, but actually it was all the interesting stuff along the way that was interesting, and that's what we have to focus on, systems of knowledge creation, flowing horizontally, experimentation, risk-taking. How do we actually evaluate that? And that's interesting when we look at the Concorde, which some people say was a classic picking winner, a stupid project. Why they do that? That's not what government's for. And they call it a failure. No one, I've looked everywhere, there's been no evaluation of all the the spillovers that occurred across many different sectors from that particular project, which did fail in the sense it's not flying. So from a private sector point of view, it's an obvious failure. From a public sector point of view, since the point is not just to get planes to fly, but to stimulate things across the economy, all these spillovers, there's been no proper, we don't have even the metrics to capture those dynamic spillovers, let alone the justifications in the first place to make sure that in the moonshots you almost worry less about getting to the moon than creating all this crazy stuff along the way, which we know stimulates growth. Now, that's sort of the backside answer. In terms of how to evaluate missions, I mean, when we spoke to the Treasury, they say that people get confused, that there's a strategic case, there's economic case, and there's a financial case. And we shouldn't be using, actually, these kind of static metrics to be looking at the strategic case, the moonshot. That's what politics is for. You win the election based on that. Now, you're saying, actually, no, you don't want, where you're saying it's too easy to say that that's what the political process is for. But you could look, the Green New Deal that's being debated now, that is how you should win the election, right? I mean, if you stand for a Green New Deal, that's what you should be campaigning for.
But I understood
But once you're in, sorry.
I understood the question as being a question not so much about the metric as about the criterion. That's where we begin in thinking about these national transformative missions. And from the standpoint of our arguments here in the course, one point of departure can be phrased in two equivalent vocabularies. So one vocabulary is the vocabulary of the democratization of opportunities and capabilities. Which initiatives of the state hold the greatest promise to democratize opportunities and capabilities on the broadest base? And the equivalent vocabulary has to do with the productivity of labor. What is the most advanced practice of production in the economy in the world? And how can that most advanced practice of production be developed in the way that disseminates it most widely in the production system? Those are actually two different ways of saying the same thing. And although they don't amount to a theory, they do represent the point of departure of a way of thinking that is available to the political agent.
But you could also, I mean, this thing that happened in the UK, which industrial strategy which they came up with the four challenges which the country decided to go for. So they said we need to focus on clean growth, aging society, future mobility. Forget the data economy, that made no sense. That was how do you say, an outcome of, in theory, had it been done properly, forget how it actually happened, but in theory, one would argue that that should be what sort of the process of politics is for. You engage society together, you decide what are the big sort of challenges, right? So the projects that you talked about, a big dam project or something, might be one of those circles, right? So when they were doing the mobility one, the idea here was that at that project level, 100% accessible public transport system, that could just become a little pet project of some politician. You don't focus, though, on that. That becomes one of the things you do along the way to achieve that sort of greater level thing. But then the question is, who decides? I think there's less of an issue of who decides these circles, because that is at that instrument level, the SBIR. How do you really do that? So, I mean, that was my point about procurement. How do you really fundamentally transform procurement, which is driven towards emissions? So these projects are being fueled by something like prizes or procurement. But the bigger question is, who decides that mission there? And the example you gave, to me, those sounded, I mean, I'm not sure where those examples came from, if these are important things in India that are being discussed system-wide and there's different takes on what we should do about those problems, or you were giving them as examples of these kind of random things that one politician might talk about. Sorry? Pretty random.
The video's over.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you so much, Mariana, for this fantastic contribution.
Interesting. Yeah? Good.
So you guys can continue.
On Monday?